G'day legends, happy Sunday. I hope that you are having a fantastic day, and so far you have also had a fantastic weekend. Now legends, realistically in the war today, not that much has been happening, but there is a book that I've wanted to speak about, and this book is by Mr. Jacques Baud called The Russian Art of War. Now as you can see, these are just some of the bits we're going to go through, but I've pulled this book apart over a number of days and weeks, and I thank the follower who actually sent me these books. He said, I think you'll get a lot out of it. So of course today, that is what we're going to speak about. We're going to speak about bits I agree with, bits which then enlightened me, and criticisms of it as well. And who is Mr. Baud also, and a large part of this too needs to talk about how I think a lot of Reddit dwellers have influenced and made toxic real military analysis through hate, misinformation, disinformation, and not seeing that just because someone can share a perspective, that is not synonymous with them then agreeing with it. And this is a fantastic quote that in my research I came upon today, but I apologise, I don't know who actually said it. And I think this is the primary point if you want to be able to analyse a situation in any way, from your friends fighting to states. Understanding an adversary requires seeing the world through their eyes without surrendering your own vision. Okay. Now, a couple of housekeeping bits and pieces in this as well is ignore some of my typing and spelling. I have a very limited time frame today, so I did sort of belt feed this out. As well, I'd love to interview Mr. Baud, the author of this, if I could get the opportunity to see where I have maybe misunderstood what he has said. But I guess his main points in this book is that the West doesn't understand and refuses to try and understand the very fundamentals of this war, so therefore they have not actually been able to put Ukraine in the best possible position. What a lot of these analysts believe, and then leaks into, of course, politics and command decisions, is starting at a point which does not actually understand the very fundamentals of the war or how Russia fight conflict, and some of the actions of which we have taken to try and positively influence Ukraine on the battlefield or politically have actually had a very negative effect on this. Okay, so we're going to go over the ins and outs of this, but just to give a quick example of this, is Russia is primarily fighting a political war and going through military actions to achieve that. This is a Clausewitzian idea, is that military actions is just in place of then a political outcome. The problem where I see a lot of the Western decision-making centres and command then in Ukraine is fundamentally fighting for their goals, which are territorial. So therefore, Russia will give up area because they may have territorial goals, but these come well after goals around policy on NATO demilitarization. But of course, that number one isn't there for Ukraine. So Russia may then take or forgo territory for attritional and policy outcomes. Okay, so that is like the main bit, is he's saying that basically the West doesn't understand the fundamentals of this. If you don't understand the fundamental, you don't know where you're going with that. So we're going to do a few bits and pieces out of this book just to begin with. These are my greeny yellow tabs. Then we'll go over all my slides breaking down and quotes from this. And then at the end, I'll back up all of that with then the blue tabs that you see in this book. But the Ukrainians have failed to understand that the West is not out to win the war for Ukraine, but to prolong it in order to exhaust Russia. And what we'll look at today and talk about further are then some of these areas back in a 2019 study about if we draw Russia into a conflict, how will that, one, extend Russia, being then the study's title, but then also what effect will it have on Ukraine and what effect will it have on NATO, which we are seeing what then the authors of this then Western think tank came up with. I think we're seeing all of that come to fruition. Now, this is an important part. It can be seen that Ukraine's centre of gravity depends very largely on the outside world, whereas Russia's is a function of its domestic policy. So remember, we talk about centre of gravity and industry sits outside of Ukraine. Now, you can put this into then strikes and their effectiveness also. We can also see that Russian and Ukrainian centres of gravities are different in nature. On the Russian side, we're dealing with a very material elements, whereas on the Ukrainian side, we're in the immaterial domain, information policy, rather than tanks and guns. And this goes into the third and fifth style of warfare. And this goes further into that idea of the two belligerents participating in this war actually fighting different wars. Now, this is the study which I shared the other day, about 5 or 6 days ago, maybe longer, and I'll post it in the Telegram as well if you'd like to have a look. But this is from, of course, the RAND Corporation, who then advises on policy. Now, they warned that this could have a significant cost for Ukraine, as well as for the prestige and credibility of the United States. It could result in a disproportionate human and territorial losses for Ukraine, as well as refugee flows. It could even lead Ukraine into a disadvantageous peace. Further in that article as well, it actually talks about then the impact it may have on NATO in itself, which of course we are seeing. So let's step then onto the slides. So this is Mr. Jacques Baud. Now, I may be pronouncing that wrong, but I apologise. He was a Colonel, Chief of Staff, a former Swiss Secret Service agent and an expert in chem and nuclear weapons. Among other things, the head of doctrine for United States peacekeeping operations in New York. So this gentleman, he's not just some random blogger online. Even if you disagree with what he says, you should still take into consideration what he has said, why he is saying it, before maybe you dismiss it. People classify anything they don't like or that they don't agree with or doesn't fit their narrative, so a lot of this is subjective, as Russian propaganda, as shill, or whatever. And we see this then seeping into academia all around the world. Now, these subjective realities that we see then coming to the forefront, in my view, this undermines any real objective analysis of this conflict. Therefore, ultimately, it influences command and political decisions. More broadly, in academia, media, professionals and universities, there's no longer a distinguishment between objective and subjective truths. This then undermines the West like a cancer. And I believe this is one of the biggest things. I'm not talking about this war here. I'm talking about so much that in the world of media, professionals, academia, universities, anything, there's a very blurry line now between what is objectively true and what is subjectively correct. Look at figures around migration, around crime, around gender. Look at any of that, and we can see that line being blurred. And I think this is seeping into the very foundations of society and is changing so much. And I do have a pessimistic view of how that will be, but we need to sit on that maybe subjective, objective at the moment. And this is why so many brilliant analysts, think tanks have been so consistently wrong with this war, despite, I believe, they know the truth deep down. But we've seen it unfold in real time. Exceptional minds who refuse to apply their own calculations, their own frameworks and methodologies to this conflict, because the conclusions which their own calculations bring are not in line with the accepted narrative. If a nail sticks up, it gets hammered down. And anyone who challenges the media or government-approved discourse is instantly labelled an enemy, a shill, a propagandist. In this way, a Kremlin shill, a Putin puppet, whatever. And this is why those who know better stay silent, if they want to keep their job, in short. They understand the consequences, the online backlash, their reputational damage, and even losing their job maybe at some of these think tanks as well. So what I'm saying is this online hate sphere and criticism, it's gone from criticism to hate to threats. This influences how a lot of these minds actually see the war and apply then wrong calculations, even if they know better, because of the discourse then and the consequence of doing that online. I know analysts behind the scenes, many of them, who they admit that they have to make their work palatable to keep their positions. why do you think so many people send me some real assessment behind the scenes? And I'm constantly saying, I wish I could interview this person, but I can't. It has to be anonymous. Now, of course, I don't have a career or a family on the line, and I'm not a salary earner like this. So why is this? And Mr. Baud touches on this, that the war in Ukraine is not only fought on the battlefield, but also in the minds of the Western public, shaped by selective narratives and omissions. Same as what he spoke about in the bit I showed you before about then the centre of gravities. Ukraine is fighting a war, but they're also fighting an informational war, one of which was very successful in the beginning, before the 24th of February 2022. Most people who now have flags in their bios or have made their entire personality about this war would not have known the Ukrainian flag and could not have pointed it out on a map. Now, everything about them is this. It's been incredibly successful. The problem is this information war, this directly impacts the frontline capabilities and decisions. Since Ukraine, of course, is entirely reliant on Western support, the success of its PR, its public relations and informational campaign is crucial. This means that any deviation from the accepted narrative, even if it is well-intentioned, can be seen as harmful. Say, for me, an objective truth is the manpower shortage. This is deviation from what is accepted. It's well-intentioned, but it can be seen as harmful. In this environment that we see, of course, it is very politically fueled. Questioning the official line isn't just dissent. It can brand you as an enemy of the state. We've even seen from spokespeople saying, well, I'll say spokesman, saying that they will hunt them down anywhere in the world. And this is seen as no different from someone holding a Russian rifle, if not even worse, as many believe of the pen is mightier than the sword. Therefore, there is a lot of subjective analysis rather than objective analysis, even if they may know better. Let's step back. Of course, we're just putting the framework down here for bits and pieces in the book. Of course, this dynamic extends now to online bloggers, YouTubers, Redditors, and even independent authors. When your audience is your income, catering to their preferences directly translates to higher engagement and therefore increased profits. The financial incentive inevitably shapes narratives. Now, I know for a fact if I took a hardline pro-Russian or hardline pro-Ukrainian stance, my earnings would skyrocket. Algorithms, they actively incentivize you to take a more hardline stance on nearly any topic. Have a look on TikTok. In politics, if you start going left, it pushes you hard left. You start going right, you end up at an Austrian painter. And of course, this extends to war and social issues, you name it. So we get the further extremes of this. And why? For algorithms, of course, it incentivizes those making that content. Nuance doesn't trend. Look at my videos. They do not trend. What trends is confirmation bias, so you're just catering to your audience what they want to hear, and outrage. Okay? Right now, if a pro-Ukrainian account, they started sharing the reality of the manpower situation, maybe what's happening in Kursk, or the power difference in negotiations at this point, they know for a fact that their core audience is going to heavily criticize them, throw names, if not worse, and ultimately this will then affect their income. Now, this strategy, this informational campaign winning strategy, this worked incredibly well for Ukraine in the beginning, given reasons I gave just before. But as I have reported, and Mr. Tatarigami UA has shared with me also in our podcast, it is now having a negative effect, because if you can't separate the two, that is trouble. Now, when propaganda and public relations influence decision-making, when the leadership and command is unable to distinguish between the two, we end up with decisions like the ones we see of movement into Kursk and reinforcement into Kursk and the delayed withdrawal from Bakhmut. So what is important is to maintain that propaganda, informational, disinformation, misinformational sphere. All of those have a slight different outcome in them, to maintain that, but not let it seep into the very fabric of your decision and policy-making centres. And then, of course, if your policy-making dissenters, their centre of gravity is then outside of the country. Now, there's been a very large change, I believe, actually in the Russian informational sphere recently, and I think this is very interesting, is we've seen a successful shift in how the Russians have embraced the idea of being perceived as, quote, the bad guys, and have sort of lent into that slide, and they've lent into that somewhat a sarcastic narrative due to the rejection of the Western ideals. Now, this approach seems to have had a morale impact on the front lines positively, and for example, you can look at the very popular Russian page called, quote, The Wrong Side, or if you look at Alex from History Legends, he recently commented on the Russians raising an orc flag from the Lord of the Rings. So basically leading into that negative imagery, negative information, playing with the perception of it, and also leaning into the narrative of the rejection of Western ideals. I believe recently that is something we have seen and has been successful. So let's look then more into the book, not at just the author and the criticisms and how then online information is pushed around. Now, let's start with my criticisms and the limitations of this book. Now, it focuses primarily on Western mistakes and may downplay Russia's strategic missteps, and also downplays, I believe, Ukraine's resilience in the face of adversity also. It does say while the West has made errors, so too has Russia, whose military campaign has faced logistical and strategic challenges. And of course, those challenges are very large. They're not to downplay. I do think it downplays the missteps we've seen and the initial idea of that Russia would have a far easier time with the war. In my opinion, as a now famous doomer online, or I would like to say that I focus more on the MDCOA, the most dangerous course of action. What the Kremlin needed, and I believe what Kyiv needs, is they need a general, not all of them, but just one of them who is a bit of a doomer, to give that most dangerous course of action and give an option that the Kremlin was missing in the very beginning of this war, which is what happens if the mission goes south very quickly? What happens if a plane full of paratroopers goes down? Ukraine is more resilient and we have logistical issues and Ukraine doesn't roll over. What happens then? So there is realistic, strategic place for maybe a more dooming aspect. You may as well plan for the most dangerous and hope that it is then the most likely. But it does downplay some of that. While it faults NATO for misreading Russia, Mr. Baud occasionally mirrors this by framing Russian tactics as uniquely superior to NATO's. It dismisses Western hubris. He risks replacing it with a romanticised Russian exceptionalism in strategy and tactics. And this gets us into the idea how Russia see war as evolving processes rather than isolated battles, and a more holistic view to war, which he believes in this book, where Russia then strategically is, we would say, uniquely superior due to that evolving process rather than being war being just isolated battles. Okay, if you're a little bit lost, we'll get further into it. Excuse some of my backgrounds here. I had no idea what else to put it on. But my biggest takeaway from this book was that Russia see war as a process, as like a growing organism and a more holistic approach. The West has and does fight like a finely tuned violin, where Russia fights as an orchestra. Now, of course, in an orchestra, an instrument can be out of tune and you'll only notice it if you isolate it, but not as a melody. So if you isolate an area of the front line and have a look, zoom right in, you may see this out of tune violin. But if you zoom right back out and you start watching the orchestra, you may not pick that up and you may see it working in harmony. Quotes here, Russia does not wage war the way Western strategists expect. It adapts, it maneuvers, and it prioritises long-term stability over short-term victories. The West is exceptional at tactics, but it lacks strategy, of course, violin and orchestra. And we see this, say, in Afghanistan and these never-ending wars. Our tactics were second to none. But as far as the strategy, what was the strategy? What was the overall political outcome that we wanted to see? I was there, and I still don't know exactly where our end goal was the goalpost kept shifting. For Russia, war is not declared. It's a continuum where peace and conflict coexist. Makes Tolstoy's War and Peace come into the front line. But let's continue talking about this. Baud accuses NATO of projecting its own logic or standards onto Russia, and this leads to miscalculations. And this is very, very important, is we add our standards, our ethics, our morals, our laws, maybe our rules more so than laws, from a rules-based order, not a laws-based order. We add that there, and maybe even the resilience of economies that are more globalised, we add that there. You can't just add this onto other states because it will lead to then miscalculations. And I say this too with like Russian generals and their military decisions, command decisions that lead, of course, into large losses in missions and then public fallout. I say you can't add our standard of how this may look onto Russia when we look at the 20th century that, of course, then unraveled and how that became with multiple revolutions. We judge Russia through the lens of our values, failing to grasp its strategic patience and willingness to endure hardship. And I think this is what we underestimate of both the Ukrainian and the Russian people and Eastern Europeans in a whole, especially as an Australian. If you just look over the 20th century, the tragedy of the 20th century belongs to the Eastern Europeans. Therefore, to endure hardship is absolutely massive. Russia's defeats have shaped its strategy more than its victories. Its genius lies in learning from collapse. And of course, we have a lot of learning from collapse. By pushing our standards, we fail to see what society will accept. As an analyst, you have to be able to see from an enemy's perspective. The issue is, if you do this, you'll be public shamed. And what I've said is it's become that if you were to share a perspective, if you can see, look, I can see why Putin was worried about this. I can see why Zelensky is concerned of this. If you say that, you are then shilling for one side rather than actually trying just to analyse from a different lens or from their then eyeballs. And of course, this leads into just paying off critical analysis. Mr. Henry Kissinger in World Order, he says of Russia that is interrupted occasionally from time to time by the need to adjust, only to return again like a tide crossing a beach. From Peter the Great to Vladimir Putin, circumstances have changed, but the rhythm has remained extraordinarily consistent. Sorry, my fast typing has killed me on that one. Please ignore my quote there. I have the book here. Kissinger also states much later on in the book, and he's talking, I believe, about China at the time, in international affairs, a reputation for reliability is more important asset than demonstrations of tactical cleverness. And the reliability, that reputation of that, and the circumstances changing, but the rhythm would put Russia is very top of this. That is why there's no excuses not to be able to see where they may see their world order moving. And of course, this links into the slide previously about being the bad guy, is the reputation, the reliability, and then the consistency here. Russia's evolving strength has to be the complete rejection of the Western way and Western standards. We see this, of course, with Putin's decrees. We see this in politics. And of course, like we've touched on recently, we see this as well with the US rejecting the European trajectory. Other countries, say as Hungary, also rejecting that. And the concern then that it meets more in that very consistent trajectory of where Russia may reject what has become the European Western subjective standard. And we see this in the book as well, that the West's role in Ukraine's defeat, he argues Western planning showed in the 2019 study called Extending Russia by RAND, of course, a Western think tank, which did show that Ukraine may have severe loss of life and infrastructure if Russia does react in military intervention while trying to extend them. While another effect it may have is that NATO frictions grow and could be undermined, which is we've seen a lot of this. Whoever wrote the RAND article must be thinking, I don't want to be correct, but I have been. Baud argues Western policies and interventions, instead of helping Ukraine, have actually worsened the country's situation. He believes that Western support has made Ukraine more dependent on foreign aid rather than strengthening its own domestic capabilities. He suggests that Ukraine has become overly reliant on Western military and financial assistance, which has left it less able to independently handle the challenges of the conflict. In short, make their own decisions. He says Western support has created a dependency that prevents Ukraine from developing its own strategies and solutions. Of course, a fantastic example of this is the very early peace negotiations, as well as what we hear rumours of Ukrainian commanders in the beginning of the 2023 counteroffensive saying we can't do this without air support, but these powers that are supporting that now completely saying we want to show profit on our money on kilometres at the front, irregardless of the cost that it may be. And I believe there's a quote right in the beginning that actually lines up with this. I apologise, I'm just going to take a second. I reckon it's marked on these very first ones. Here we go. President of Mexico summed this up in June 22 about the NATO and EU policy. He says, "We supply the weapons, you supply the corpses. It's immoral." Now, he also says that Western involvement, this has escalated the war rather than helping to bring it to a peaceful resolution. By supplying Ukraine with advanced weapon systems and financial support, he believes that the West has given Russia more reasons to escalate its own military actions. By continuously supporting Ukraine, the West has inadvertently strengthened Russia's resolve and therefore prolonged the conflict and maybe even given it more maximalist goals. Why do I say maybe more maximalist goals? Well, has a position to undermine NATO presented itself very recently, maybe there. He criticised the West for not fully understanding Russia's goals and military strategy. He says Western actions are often based on a flawed understanding of the situation, which misaligns with Ukraine's true needs. This has led to interventions that focus more on opposing Russia than addressing Ukraine's immediate challenges. So you're trying to oppose and draw down Russia's power rather than what does Ukraine need right now. In summary, he argues that while Western support is well-intentioned, it hasn't helped Ukraine effectively. Instead, it has created dependency and escalated the conflict, leaving Ukraine in a difficult and prolonged war. For their own gain, for the West's own gain, using Ukraine as a proxy, as per basically what Rand's study talked about. Quote, Western nations, in their own obsession with weakening Russia, have made Ukraine a pawn rather than a partner. And we see this because there's still no realistic willingness to allow Ukraine in NATO or in the EU or allow them to use advanced weapon systems. Again, let's continue. Something that we have been touching on a lot recently is we've put a reverse on the idea that might is right, and that the NATO and the EU, they're seeing, on just the West, that right is might. That being just right will lead to victory, without being able to understand that from Putin to IS, that they believe that they are just as right. As I said in the beginning of this video, understanding an adversary requires seeing the world through their eyes without surrendering your own vision. Putin believes that he is just as right, that he is just as, or more so, he believes he is more right, he is as justified as whatever, as Macron or Scholz or Zelensky. That's why we have to look at believing you are right does not mean that therefore you will have the might to win, because they see themselves as just as justified from any corner of the globe. And Mr. Baud, he touches on this just as we have recently. NATO countries like the US, UK, France, they often frame their actions as morally justified or, quote, defending democracy, while painting Russia as inherently aggressive or immoral. The moral overconfidence leads NATO to underestimate Russia's strategic resilience, basically saying that they are just savages out in the East who don't know any of this, such as assuming Ukraine will inevitably prevail simply because good versus evil narratives suggest a virtue guarantees victory, a mindset that ignores the messy realities of modern warfare. And I believe that is an incredibly important point, which we'll pick at that thread at some point in the future, especially when the war ends, wherever that does. Now, one of the central ideas to this book is that we, the West, we fail to understand the Russian way of seeing this war as a defensive position. And this is why Putin focuses so much on history. This is what he says in this, that we just don't understand the very fundamentals of how Russia fight and why Russia is fighting. He argues that Russian military doctrine is fundamentally shaped by historical psychology of survival. And this is giving a counter-narrative to the Western portrayals of Russia as an inherently expansionist or imperialist power, saying that Russia, following centuries of invasions, Mongol, Napoleon is not ice cream, or the Nazis, and a century of collapse through Tsarist Russia, the Soviet Union, he argues that Russia's actions are actually in a defensive essence, that this is how Putin sees this. Even when this is aggressive in execution, they see it as defensive, and that this reframing these interventions in Georgia, Ukraine, and Syria not as a revisionist ambition, but as efforts to secure these buffer zones against a perceived NATO encirclement. So defensive against that with then aggressive execution. It's very interesting to play around with that idea and why Putin then focuses so much on history and NATO. Now, I'm not saying you have to agree with it. You may disagree with it vehemently, but that's why it is important. If you want to understand the war doesn't just come out of nowhere. You have to see why do they see it like this if you want to actually be able to analyse it, even if you disagree with it. There's a quote in here that says, Russia's wars are fought in the shadow of its past. Every move is a calculation to avoid becoming the victim of someone else's history. And there's a paranoia about further invasion here. And even if NATO is not a real threat to Russia, there's this then paranoia around, well, we thought that we had then deals with that the Germany wasn't going to do this or this wasn't going to do that, and well back, that it's seen as this almost preemptive defensive capability that then is aggressive in execution. And I really say you should look through this book. There's some very, very interesting bits. Now, what I am going to do is we're going to belt feed through some of these because there are some very important parts in here that I may have spoken about, not touched on, that will give some context to this. Particularly of this conflict is that the Western side, the aim was not to help Ukraine win, but it was to force Russia to lose. The ultimate aim is not so much to win back territory as to bring about Vladimir Putin's downfall. This leads into the idea of we supply the weapons and you supply the corpses. Russian military thought, chapter 2, that the adversary is so stupidly demonized that we fail to understand his way of thinking. And if you try and understand that way of thinking, well, you, sir, you will be demonized as well. Now look at me, look at other analysts who have just tried to add something, tried to add nuance. Tactical objectives must promote the achievement of operational objectives, which in turn must promote the achievement of strategic objectives of a political or military nature. This is a very Clausewitzian idea where he says that NATO, whereas we just don't really understand where the difference is between tactics, that tactical actions on the front line, they have to lead into strategy, which then leads to political objectives overall. So Russia will use tactics in the front line to influence its strategy, to influence its military objectives, therefore to get its political outcome it wants, ultimately of Ukraine demilitarized or Ukraine in a place where it cannot join NATO. Now, in other words, it's about turning operational successes into strategic successes into political successes. Of course, very idea around Clausewitzian's idea of looking then into warfare. Then a correlation of forces is chapter 3 for the war in Ukraine, or the special military operation, as he says. The Russians have a holistic approach to war, taking into account all factors that directly or indirectly influence the conflict. Conversely, as we have seen in Ukraine and elsewhere, Westerners have a much more political reading of the war and end up mixing the two. This is why communication plays an essential role in the conduct of war. The perception of the conflict plays nearly a more important role than its reality. So, as we spoke about in those beginning slides, the perception of it. This is why people come down so heavily on anyone trying to add maybe a nuance or a separate view or just even their opinion, seen as then an enemy of the state. He talks then about, what is this one called? Objectives and strategy. Now, the Russians understand war from a Clausewitzian perspective. Of course, a Prussian commander wrote the book on war. You should read that too. Maybe do a bit more study into that book before you read the book itself. It may not really make sense. War is the pursuit of politics by other means. This means that they seek to transform operational successes into strategic successes, military success into political objectives. Thus, the demilitarization evoked by Putin is clearly linked to the military threat to the populations of the Donbass. Let's continue on. And of course, wanting to meet then objectives of, say, Ukraine not joining NATO, this is military actions trying to influence policy. Now, Vladimir Putin's declared objectives of demilitarization, denazification are not about gaining territory, but about destroying potential. The Ukrainians are fighting for territory while the Russians are seeking to destroy capability. You can always take back territory, but you can't take back human lives. And this is one of the things. This is what I say. One, these are much harder to judge a victory on. How do you judge demilitarization, denazification? How do you judge that? You can't. How do you judge territory? Well, kilometre squares. You draw a fucking line through it. It's very easy. That's why Russia is going to be able to sell a win better to the population than the Ukrainian side will. But this is the thing. It's about destroying potential. And this is where these different war objectives are very important, is therefore to destroy potential. Russia will be more willing to lose ground rather than Ukraine may be less willing to lose ground because they're fighting really a territorial war in the beginning. This is why Kursk, that I believe Russia could have mobilised the forces in a few weeks to crush the Kursk incursion, but that I believe the generals who are in charge of that would have looked and gone, look, informationally, this is very negative. But we can play this to our advantage by creating a zone where Ukraine is surrounded on three sides in here to quote Mr. Baud, to crush the potential. Now, this comes from a Ukrainian soldier with the Times of London. This is at the launch of the 23 counter-offensive. This was titled, "Our allies are asking us to advance with guns in our backs. Our allies have helped us a lot, but their political leaders are demanding that we take territories in conditions where they wouldn't think of sending their own soldiers." And as a former soldier myself, there's no way with the conditions around air superiority, all the conditions that the 2023 counteroffensive would not have been launched. And we've seen negative impact that has had and probably basically destroyed any offensive capability from that point onwards. We have not seen any major offensive campaigns since. But of course, that was based on information, because it would have been probably way more successful if launched later or in 2024. But the Western powers, of where the centre of gravity is, then wanted to see then return on investment. So really should read it. There's bits I disagree with. I disagree with the lack of criticism towards the Russian Ministry of Defense, and especially the strategic oversight very early on, as well as real impacts on the economy and losses as well. But I think it's a very, very interesting read, and something people should to balance their ideas and go through it with a highlighter and a pen like I have done and get a better understanding from someone who, again, isn't just nobody online. Legends, you have a fantastic, you have a fantastic day, and I'll speak to you tomorrow. Thank you. Bye-bye.